After a confusing year of mixed signals, we finally tried to have sex. But I couldn't get hard, and it ruined everything. I have a very complicated history with my first ex-girlfriend. We tend to seek each other out when it is not feasible, and just as things seemed to be improving, I believe I messed up by being unable to maintain an erection during our inaugural sexual encounter. I feel uneasy discussing the final part of this story with anyone in real life, and I am at a loss for what to do currently. The embarrassment I am experiencing is intense. Apologies for the lengthy post, which may come off as somewhat rant-like, but here it goes. There is girl A, whom I met several years ago. She was stunning, humorous, and the most compassionate person I had ever encountered. She became my first girlfriend, and truthfully, she altered the course of my life during a very dark period that I was navigating. She was the reason I found the strength to continue living, and it was because of her that I eventually sought help by seeing a psychologist and discussing my depression with my family. Regrettably, our relationship did not last long. In my opinion, this was largely due to the pressure I placed on her regarding my mental health struggles, which diminished her attraction toward me. Despite the fact that our breakup was extremely painful for me, and I made several attempts to win her back, we still held each other in high regard and maintained affection for one another. During our time together, I educated her on many aspects of sex. My slightly older age meant I had always been interested in this subject and had taken the initiative to learn about it. However, we did not engage in sexual relations, believing we were too young and should wait a bit longer. There was a considerable amount of sexual tension, and we frequently fantasized about losing our virginities to each other. Years have flown by, and I can now confidently say that I am in a much better state than I have ever been. My depression and negative thoughts have been under control for quite some time. Last year, she reached out to me, mentioning that she had been reminiscing about old conversations and photos and expressed that she missed me significantly. I politely declined to engage, as I was content in another relationship. While I will always have a fondness for her, my feelings do not extend to romantic interest. That marked the conclusion of that chapter. That subsequent relationship, however, lasted only a few months as it deteriorated rapidly for various reasons. Just days after my breakup, I contacted A, asking if we could take a walk together since I needed to talk to her. I was experiencing some sudden negative emotional responses towards her and wanted to address that. I could provide additional context, but this post is already quite lengthy. She agreed, and we began taking walks occasionally, which allowed me to resolve my inner turmoil and reminded me how delightful it was to converse with her again. It felt akin to reconnecting with an old friend, for indeed, she is one and seamlessly picking up from where we had left off. We also discussed our relationships, what went wrong, and sought closure on certain aspects. Over time, I realized I had developed feelings for her once more, which I expressed to her multiple times. She was uncertain about her feelings, so we chose to continue spending time together and see how things unfolded, but progress was slow. I attempted to kiss her once, but she evaded me, leading me to understand that we were likely just friends. The day after Christmas, she brought up the idea of coming over to my place to watch a movie. That evening, she unexpectedly kissed me, saying she felt compelled to do so and asked me not to overthink it, which I did. We stayed up until 5 a.m. watching films and cuddling. When we grew tired, she requested to sleep with me rather than have me walk her home, a short distance of 10 minutes, and I could not have been happier. Then, on New Year's, we met at our town's New Year's celebration, and I attempted to kiss her once more, but she again avoided my advances as her friends were nearby, and she is quite timid. Later, she left before I did. On my way home, I took a stroll around town, unable to locate her, so I sent a tipsy message, and she promptly replied. Once again, she asked to stay at my house, as her sister was at their house with friends smoking marijuana. So I picked her up, and we ended up sleeping together for the second time. Nothing sexual occurred since we were both quite inebriated. From that point, things became distant again for about a month until just recently. I revisited a string of messages and realized February 4 marked the anniversary of our meeting. I sent her a heartfelt message expressing her significance in my life, commenting on the amusing nature of our ongoing cat and mouse dynamic, where we pursue each other only when one of us is uninterested. I also invited her out for dinner. She accepted, and we met yesterday. My initial plan was to go to a lovely restaurant, but she insisted on picking up some pizzas to enjoy at a small pier by the beach, an area we had frequented before for our talks. I relented, and we did just that, but we left shortly after due to the biting cold and wind. We stopped by a friend's bar to say hello and use the restroom. Afterward, we sat down to enjoy some music while I sipped a beer. She opted out of alcohol since she planned to go clubbing later. We walked towards our section of town, sharing wild stories about drinking and partying. She became excited and insisted on purchasing Jägermeister and a mixer. Didn't want to drink, to take back to my house for a movie. Halfway through the film, boredom set in, and we decided to find a drinking game. I downloaded an app and we had a fantastic time. I ended up quite drunk, and since it was late, we headed to bed while watching some cartoons on my computer. I don't recall the subsequent moments too clearly, but we began kissing, and she directly told me that she wanted to engage in sexual intercourse. I chuckled and explained that if she truly desired that, she shouldn't have allowed me to drink so much. Instead, I offered to pleasure her orally, which she declined, stating it would only heighten her desire for intercourse. I suggested we wait until the morning, and she said, "We'll see." This morning, despite having had little sleep, I felt much better and rather frisky. I freshened up a bit. She did the same soon after, put on some soft music, and cuddled with her again. We spent several hours kissing and taking turns selecting songs, many of which were quite explicit. I kept hinting at my desire for sex, and I believe she also wanted it, but she is extremely bashful when sober, as often happens after consuming alcohol, and giggled nervously. By this stage, we were only in our underwear, which was quite steamy in more ways than one. I pressed a little and playfully pounced on top of her, reminding her that with her looking so alluring on my bed, how could I not want to have sex with her? We started making out, and eventually, she ended up on top, grinding against me as we kissed. I was aroused by this point. Then, our underwear was off, and she was on the verge of taking me inside her. I halted her and inquired whether she was using any form of birth control. She replied no, but expressed that she wanted to feel me and that I should ejaculate outside. I jokingly reminded her about what I had taught her regarding sex and the associated risks. Normally, I need to maintain a specific rhythm to reach climax, which gives me confidence in timing my withdrawal. However, I also know that I produce significantly more pre-ejaculatory fluid than average, so I ruled that out and insisted on a condom. At this moment, my erection began to diminish, and I was unsure if it was nerves related to this encounter I had fantasized about or if the alcohol still lingered in my system. Perhaps knowing she wanted to engage in something so risky overwhelmed me. I simply do not know. I put on the condom despite being only semi-erect and started stroking myself to regain full arousal. She began kissing and touching me, but nothing improved the situation. I started rubbing her clitoris and teasing her vulva, which I usually find incredibly arousing, but it didn't work. I even attempted to use a cock ring I had bought out of curiosity, but it merely hung loosely without any stimulation. She was gazing at me and attempted to touch me, but by that point, I was consumed by embarrassment and retreated to the bathroom to compose myself. I even attempted to watch pornography, but that did not help either. When I returned to my room, she looked annoyed, having realized nothing was forthcoming and feeling teased for no reason. I was mortified, profusely apologizing and searching for clarity in my mind. She stated she needed to leave, began dressing, and playfully teased that I had left her hanging. I dressed as well since I always walk her home, but this time she asked me not to. I tried to explain my panic, saying she made me quite nervous, that the alcohol had not assisted, and that it was certainly not her fault as she is extraordinarily beautiful. She joked that she knew it wasn't merely her fault. I fumbled for additional words but found myself blank, and so she departed. I quickly messaged her again, seeking to reiterate my apology, affirming that I understood if she was no longer interested in me, and expressing that if she was willing, I would like to attempt a second chance. Setting that aside, I expressed gratitude for a wonderful evening filled with laughter. Her response simply read, "Sin mas tranqui," we communicate in Spanish, and I am unsure how to interpret it. Translated, it means, "Whatever, don't stress about it," but I can't determine if she is saying, "It's fine, such things happen and I still think highly of you," or, "Whatever, don't contact me again." Another point of confusion for me was that she seemed entirely ready for sex and was comfortable with me touching her, yet she did not want me to fully see her. She kept her bra on and did not permit me to view her vulva or engage orally. I believe she is quite self-conscious about her body, and I certainly feel that way too, but to me, participating in sex involves creating a safe and accepting environment, and I found it disheartening that I had to expose myself completely while she held back. Story 2. After 6 years, I found proof of my girlfriend's infidelity while struggling with my own past mistakes. Emotions ran wild, but I feel stuck. I have experienced periods of being harmful, but have engaged in significant efforts to heal. While I am not yet where I aspire to be, I am making progress every day. It seems, however, that my girlfriend continues to grow increasingly toxic. My mind and body have disengaged, yet my heart remains invested. I have finally obtained evidence that she was unfaithful. Firstly, I have genuinely loved this girl since our initial meeting. At the start, we were both immature and unhealthy for one another. Approximately 6 months after we met, her drinking escalated and became one of the main issues after she became physical while I was driving one night. After we separated, she inexplicably began dating my next-door neighbor. Although I believe the initial meeting was coincidental, the continuation of the relationship was certainly intentional. Ultimately, we reconciled about 4 months later, which is where I will begin the main narrative. Around this period, I came out as transgender, female to male, and she was one of my strongest supporters in our small college town. Following a particularly negative experience, we relocated to a more progressive state and city. We both recognized that this accelerated the progression of our relationship too quickly, but since that was 5 years ago, it is too late to change. At that time, it was still quite publicly known via social media that we were together. Fast forward a few months, I began to exhibit the effects of transitioning. During this time, she became very friendly with other women, and our sexual intimacy evaporated. This severely affected me mentally, leading me to feel unattractive and as though my partner despised me. She explained that her behavior was unrelated to me and stemmed from her attempts to cope with a past assault that occurred a few months prior to our meeting. After roughly 4 to 5 months of these feelings and ongoing, extremely toxic arguments from both of us, I found validation among strangers online while she sought it from people in her personal life. Her validations included plans to meet others and even book hotel rooms, while mine were more explicit yet less personal. The evening I discovered she was engaging in those activities was the same night she allegedly blacked out from her medication and mistook me for her assailant. This incident resulted in her becoming physical, me restraining her contacting the police and claiming I had kicked down the door, and my subsequent arrest on domestic violence charges. Both of us had been drinking. It took several months for her to drop the charges, during which I repeatedly told her that if she remembered me doing those things, we should not be together. She used this period to threaten to call the police on me during every disagreement. To be fair, I did raise my voice and say some rude things, but I was never physically abusive. 7 months later, the charges were dismissed. By this point, we had both stopped drinking and were improving. However, with the combined stress of the situation, living in a new environment, undergoing a medical transition, and coping with the death of my grandmother, I became quite uninvolved. I failed to contribute around the house and was not as available as a partner. I felt jealous of a specific coworker of hers, vividly recalling her drawing hearts on her food container and referring to her as beautiful. I acknowledge I was likely overreacting. I recognize that jealousy is an issue I struggle with, but throughout this experience, I have realized that many of my fears were rooted in reality. I firmly believe that while you cannot control the actions of others, you can certainly address concerns when you notice something. During this time, probably somewhat earlier, I became non-existent on her social media. I was no longer her friend on any platform. In fact, I was entirely blocked from viewing any of it. This was attributed to my controlling nature. I moved past this for a few years. In those years, our relationship became a cycle of highs and lows. I communicated openly about my emotions, while she expressed her dissatisfaction months later. It was a recurring theme of her feeling unable to go out with friends, me encouraging her to go, and then discovering that she had been out much later than she had said, often finding out she lied about minor details. For example, I know one of those nights was a girls' night verified by photo evidence, but she later claimed she was at a restaurant after it had closed. It was little lies like these that I felt confronted with constantly. Fast forward to last April. I had been incredibly supportive of a friendship she had at work until I met him. He was rude, did not acknowledge me or even look in my direction, laughing with her instead, even after she introduced us. I admit that previously both of us had overshared personal matters with friends and coworkers, but at this point, I had refrained from discussing our relationship, yet I was aware she had confided something to him. After that incident, I became extremely paranoid about him. I discovered she followed him on all social media platforms and that they communicated frequently. I was made to feel that I was being overly controlling. I would read every single message to her, even those from family, but never once did I see or hear anything inappropriate. During this tumultuous time, an old friend reached out to me. I should have known better than to reply. I firmly maintain a rule of not engaging with anyone I could be attracted to in a different context, but she was experiencing similar challenges. I regret hiding this. It involved 2 weeks of conversation, none of which was flirty. I even spoke positively of my girlfriend, which I would not have done under typical circumstances. Nevertheless, I must admit that concealing this lengthy exchange and maintaining communication with someone else behind my partner's back constituted cheating. By this point, we were also involved in heavy substance abuse, cocaine. Although we are currently sober, keep that in mind for later. I spent weeks addressing her questions, delving into my thoughts to understand why I made that choice, and remaining patient, knowing that I had made an error. During this time, I also felt compelled to check her phone. Unsurprisingly, I found messages with the man I was concerned about from work. Before I could read further, she seized her phone and deleted the messages. In April 2024, we were both struggling individually, as a couple, and in all aspects of our lives. We decided to take a break from work, and I could financially support us. We began to focus on our relationship, and it appeared we were doing better. There were setbacks, yes, but it felt like we could both express ourselves openly, and I felt less like I was tiptoeing around my feelings. Although our sexual intimacy was minimal, it was happening more frequently than it had since 2019. A few months ago, I stumbled upon the last remnants of messages from an unknown contact. These were not alarming, yet she was still concealing them, not mentioning me, and simply flattering herself. As I uncovered these, she woke up to find me searching and reacted with panic, claiming she had not done anything wrong. Our dogs were distressed due to her erratic behavior. It was past midnight in our apartment, so I asked her to calm down. I remained composed throughout. I had anticipated this moment, which is why I limited how often I had gone through her phone. I filmed the incident on my phone so she could not delete it and deny it later. She managed to erase the evidence and dismissed my concerns each time I attempted to discuss it with her. When I confronted her with my findings, I sought to engage her calmly. However, I was interrupted continuously. I simply inquired about how long she had been in contact with him, receiving the response that they had exchanged messages 3 times. I expressed disbelief, asking how she could send half-naked pictures to someone with whom she had merely conversed thrice, yet not to the one with whom she was building a life and paying for everything. She attributed her actions to the challenges posed by our substance abuse. Now that we are sober, I asked why she was still messaging our former dealer in that manner. She argued it was due to her battling addiction and concern over retaining that contact. We often converse about the struggles of sobriety, and regardless, she was still planning to meet him. Essentially, I have repeatedly asked her to leave, resulting in her response of reaching for pills in a suicidal gesture. I have begged her for honesty, only to receive deceit. I have asked her to engage in a calm discussion with me, but it always leads to her yelling at me for expressing myself. I do not wish to lose her, but I can't shake the feeling that this is my breaking point. I find it difficult to believe anything truthful has come from this relationship. I now harbor resentment over how much I've financially supported her only to receive this in return. She is currently unemployed, which causes me to feel guilty about pushing her away, yet I would never fully trust her while she is employed elsewhere. I am uncertain if I could ever fully trust her again, especially lacking honesty. I am past the major concerns and ready to move forward, but I still struggle with the small matters, like her recognizing the different types of eye rolls I give or chuckling at our inside jokes. Things had improved significantly. I felt as though we were both in love simultaneously and were working toward something meaningful. All of that seems to have vanished now. She clearly fails to recognize her errors and cannot calm herself enough to have a conversation about it. Instead, she responds with an overwhelming display of affection and acts of service that feel like love bombing. I am not convinced she will genuinely work on herself, especially since she appears to view it as merely her brain being malfunctioning. So here I am, unsure of what to do next. We are on a lease together. While I can exit it, I do not want to put her in a difficult situation. I desire to be with her, but I also do not want a lifetime of misery. I apologize for the lengthy message. Story 3. At my sister's emergency C-section, her ex forged her name, naming their son Valentino. 6 years later, I got his new wife's baby named after her. Obligatory apology for formatting as I am on my mobile device. This is somewhat my vengeance, somewhat my sister's, and both of us are genuinely proud. This will be lengthy, so a brief summary is at the bottom. Here are our characters. My sister, we will refer to her as Sarah. For the story, sister's ex-boyfriend, Paul, ex-boyfriend's current wife, Jane, ex-boyfriend's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, oldest brother, Zeke, our parents and me when I was 14, and my oldest sister, Sarah, was 22. We discovered that she was expecting a child with Paul, her boyfriend of 4 years. They quickly became engaged and were genuinely happy. For a while, Sarah experienced a terrible pregnancy. By around 16-18 weeks, the wonder of creating a human dissipated. She developed hyperemesis, which, if you are unaware, is severe morning sickness, was in constant pain, developed gestational diabetes, and overall detested the experience. Around this period, Paul, her then fiancé, began to express frustration with her complaints. The argument was essentially, "Your body is designed for this, it cannot be that unpleasant." Sarah was due around Valentine's Day, and Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, were very enthusiastic, both about becoming grandparents and the possibility that the baby might be born on a holiday. She strongly opposed that and sincerely hoped her son would not arrive on a holiday, even one as minor as Valentine's Day. Her birthday occasionally falls on Easter, which she dislikes, because it may make him feel that his day is not very much about him. Mrs. Doe suggested something like, "If you name him Valentine or Valentino, it will make the day even more special for him." Once again, Sarah detested the idea. She believed it was tacky, he would be bullied for it, and she simply did not like the name Valentino. Paul loved it but agreed to choose a more conventional name like Daniel or Jared. Fast forward to February, and Sarah was ready to bring this to an end. She had officially been placed on bed rest because standing or walking caused her blood pressure to experience unexpected spikes and drops. Looking back now, I truly empathize with her. She tried her best to avoid giving birth on Valentine's Day because she didn't want that for her son. Unfortunately, births occur when they do, and that baby would be born on Valentine's Day, whether she liked it or not. I recall waiting in the waiting room with my father, brothers, and Paul, who opted not to be in the delivery room because he deemed it gross. I was furious that he could have entered but chose not to because he found my sister gross during childbirth, while I had to remain outside due to my being too young to accompany my mother and sister. Dad went home with the 2 youngest brothers while the oldest, Zeke, stayed to look after me because I refused to leave. 16 hours after Sarah went into labor, my little nephew officially became a part of the family on the evening of Valentine's Day. Regrettably, Sarah's condition was serious. She required an emergency cesarean section, and during the surgery, it was discovered that the back of her uterus, facing her spine, had a very large and severe, thankfully non-cancerous, tumor. When I say large, I mean it was twice the size of a typical uterus. The doctors were astonished and could not comprehend why this had not been detected in an ultrasound. It explained her severe back pain and blood pressure problems. The medical team immediately proceeded with further surgery to remove the tumor, but sadly they had to perform a complete hysterectomy. This meant that my nephew would be Sarah's only child. While Sarah was in surgery, Paul was managing everything related to the baby to ensure his son was all right. In my memory as a 14-year-old, I recall him appearing quite upset, but I did not focus on him much and spent my time in the waiting area with my mother and other sister. However, Zeke wanted to be a responsible future brother-in-law and check on Paul. He found Paul alone, filling out the baby paperwork, looking in my brother's words, like he didn't have a care in the world. Zeke inquired why Paul didn't wait for Sarah to complete the paperwork since she was expected to come out of surgery soon, and Paul replied that he wanted her to rest and recover. Zeke, being 16 at the time, accepted this explanation without question. Now you may be wondering. No, he couldn't possibly. He knows how much she despises that name. Plus, she would have to sign the paperwork too. My fellow Redditors, I regret to inform you that Paul forged Sarah's signature on the paperwork and waited until she emerged from surgery to present it. My sweet nephew, born on Valentine's Day, was named Valentino on his first official birth certificate. To this day, I still do not understand why Paul and his family were so adamant about that name. He had even chosen a different one with my sister. And before you inquire, no, he was never charged with forgery because his parents claimed to have witnessed her signing the documents, despite arriving only at the last moment. Consequently, Sarah ended the relationship and had her son's name changed a month later. She was willing to share custody as he was the father of her child and she wanted her son to know him, but Paul disappeared, and she never heard from him again, which seemed unusually out of character for him. Until 6 months later, when a mutual friend tagged him in wedding photos on Facebook. Paul had apparently started cheating on her shortly after she became pregnant. Sarah was furious, but there was little she could do, so she filed for child support and continued living her life. Fast forward 6 years. This is where the revenge begins, my friends. Sarah had been an incredible single mother for the past 6 years. At this point in my career, I had been working as a hairdresser at our local Great Clips for about 8 months. One day, while at work, who should come in for a service but Jane, Paul's current wife. I escorted her back for a trim, and she clearly had no idea who I was. This made sense as a mutual friend who still keeps in touch with Paul had mentioned that Jane was completely unaware. She didn't know anything about Sarah, that she had been the other woman, or that Paul actually had a child for whom he had been infrequently paying child support. She was entirely in the dark. I resolved not to be rude and treated her like a normal customer, which I did. At this point, Jane was heavily pregnant, so much of our conversations centered around that. She was enjoying her pregnancy, but found it challenging, and her husband was quite unsympathetic, a major surprise. And she was due in 10 weeks without having selected a name for their baby girl. Esteemed readers, this was my opportunity. I asked what kind of name she was considering, and she said, "I want something unique and unusual, but not ridiculous like Braintlier." You know the names I'm referring to, and Paul had suggested countless options, yet she disliked them all. I, being a clever little schemer, suggested, "What about Sarah? My sister's name is not actually Sarah. She was named after an older family member who passed away shortly after her birth, but there was no feminine counterpart for his name, so our parents created one. It is a lovely name and perfectly matched what Jane desired. She adored it, embraced it, and months later, I discovered through monitoring her Facebook that she had insisted on it, and that became their daughter's name. Now Paul has a daughter with his ex's name as a constant reminder of his past and to motivate him to fulfill his child support obligations. My little nephew is now 10 years old with a new name and no contact with his biological father, although we still occasionally refer to him as Val within the family. He enjoys it, but prefers not to take it to school, so it remains a family nickname. Sarah pretends to dislike it when we call him that, but it's all in good humor. As long as he is happy with it, she has no issues. Additionally, she is dating a wonderful man who is like a father figure to Val. Summary: my sister's child's father forged her signature on paperwork during her surgery to name their son, a name she had vehemently opposed from the start. He then cut off all contact after she ended the relationship and married the woman he had been cheating on her with while she was pregnant. 6 years later, I encountered his wife and persuaded her to name their daughter after my sister, as she was oblivious to my sister's existence and her son. Edit: I now understand what they mean by "rest in peace" inbox. Thank you to the generous strangers for the awards, especially the gold. We did not anticipate this to gain such traction. Val wants to convey to all the other Valentine's babies that he sympathizes with your struggles.